Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a new series, one I'm really excited about. I've been kind of putting this off for a while, but I thought, all right, let's just do this. This is sort of a modern interpretation of the Trivium. And the idea here is the modern education system, which I don't want to spend a lot of time criticizing. I've done that before. It certainly has a different style of education than one would have received in the classical world, the Renaissance world. And there's a lot of reasons to want to rethink that. Another aspect of it is for people who either did not have the opportunity to have an education or the kind of education they want, or were educated, went to college, but found that the education they received, while it may have achieved some other goals, really didn't provide what they wanted. And so I've received a lot of messages. In fact, the number one set of questions and emails that I receive tend to revolve around this question. So I thought, okay, at long last, here is what I'm calling a modern take on the Trivium, and how to reconceptualize this and do this for yourself. So this is how can one go about educating oneself in the modern world, but within the context of how education used to be done in the classical world. So that's the goal of this series. And there's a lot there to go over, but I want in this first introductory section is talk about sort of the background, what this means, and why this might be coming up so repeatedly as a topic, sort of frame it. Then I'll get into more concrete aspects of this in the following lectures. So to begin with, to understand that in the classical world, and this is a mix of, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Renaissance, Europe, and sort of classical China. Those are sort of the models that I'm drawing on here, and a little bit more about that in a second. But the idea was, if you were getting an education, you were an important person by definition. And so the goal of the education was allow you to express and use the power that you almost certainly were going to have. And the real core of it boils down to a very simple to articulate, difficult to execute concept, which is to understand yourself. If you think about man as the measure of all things, classical Greek claim, well, this means that understanding yourself becomes core to understanding other things, of course, because you're using yourself as a yardstick. And second, then to understand the world. So all you need to do to give a classical view on all this is to have a good grasp of yourself and a complete understanding of the world. So again, easy to articulate, a bit tricky in execution, of course. However, this doesn't mean that it is impossible. It just means that it's always a work in progress. This is never completed. And so to address this and try to bring these sorts of concepts into the modern world, it would be inappropriate. It would be sort of a misrepresentation to simply say, okay, this is what they did in ancient Greece or this is what they did in ancient Rome. Just copy that, because the context is so completely different that even if you did exactly what they did, you would not achieve what I'm, sort of having to guesstimate people are actually after, which is sort of the results of the kind of education that was being granted in those times, rather than, a strict copy of precisely their methods. Although in some cases, let's just strictly copy their methods where they seem appropriate. But some of this just contextually makes no sense. For instance, the notion, of course, if you were in the ancient Greek world, being completely fluent and perfecting your ancient Greek really mattered. And similarly, if you're in the Roman world, actually the leaders of Rome spoke Greek as well. So this is one of their big distinguishers of quality, but of course their Latin needed to be very effective as well. So, and then famously, of course, for a lot of times, the use of Latin became a distinguisher of someone who was educated. And so having a really high quality Latin meant that you were super educated. Now that kind of model, it just doesn't make sense in the modern world. But learning English actually would be more appropriate, because Latin was the language of power in the world, and today English is the language of power, in one way to think about this. So, just doing a rote copy makes no sense. And so what I'm doing is trying to construct what those elements that I think are most apposite for trying to achieve our ends today. And to wit, I am drawing on a sort of mix of the classical trivium and quadrivium, which I'll talk about. These are the two classical systems of ancient Rome, obviously, from tri and quad. A smattering of the Renaissance, because the Renaissance introduced some more elements as civilization is progressing, as the context changes, it becomes more modern, and a dash of Taoism, which I think is an important element to add, particularly in the modern world, oddly, that Taoism has some core educational concepts that I think really do translate well to the sorts of challenges we face today, that speak to some issues that were less relevant in the classical era, but they still talked about. So note, this is a mix, and this is sort of an idiosyncratic mix. Like, this is not, again, I could lay out the trivium and quadrivium for you, no problem. Go, this is what you do. That would be very simple. You can look this up. It's not that complicated. But I don't think this is what people really want or what they're interested in. So this is idiosyncratic, though. So I want to underline that and not go like, oh, this is what the trivium is. No, this is a sort of application of the core principles of the trivium as you can interpret that in the world that we actually inhabit today, as opposed to one from 2,000 years ago. Second, this is not the education I received. So this is an important note. Like, I'm not saying this is the process that I went through. I would have loved to have gone through this process. However, I was not raised in a house that had books. We didn't really do books. We really didn't do education. And went to a series of sort of sketch educational institutions, as I'm sure many of us did. I was fortunate enough to live at a time when I could go to college and support myself working. And so today, I know this is a ridiculous thought for people in the United States, at least, the notion that just working a sort of sketchy job, or a series of sketchy jobs that I had. I worked at a hardware store, I worked at a sandwich shop, I did odd jobs in the summer. But even doing that, I was still able to pay my tuition and stay in school for an absurd number of years because I just kept going. That is one of the things that was fortunate for me. But in doing this process, I took random. I took anything that I thought looked interesting to me in the course catalog. And because it was sufficiently affordable, I was able to do that as an undergrad for 5 years and take just a crazy collection of courses under no sort of organizing principle, except for a while it occurred to me that looked interesting in the course catalog. Let's enroll in that. So I am not claiming that, I went through this system and then this helped me, produce what I produce today, because it's not true. But there are core elements here that I wish I had, that I sort of feel like I had to backfill for myself because I did not have the kind of background or, sort of culture of learning that would have helpfully made this much easier and much simpler for me. And so the people I really want to speak to, well, I want to speak to everyone, of course, but really if you feel like, again, you either got an education that didn't fit you or that you didn't have that opportunity, maybe you're an immigrant, you don't have the money, you don't have the language skills, all these sorts of things. Like, this is what I'm trying to do, is reconstruct a system and say, hey, the world is there, this is available to you, this sort of education is possible, and here's how to go about doing it. And then finally, and this is sort of the warning about this content, is the problem with the classical education. Barzan speaks about this in other terms. In the book House of the Intellect, if anybody's interested, lots of interesting things to talk about in there from Barzan. Other thinkers have talked about this as well. How do you put this? Well, you're going to be alienated. It's an alienating process because, in essence, the kind of classical education that you might be interested in, and the kind that was received in the ancient world and the Renaissance, was rare. It set you apart. And anytime you set yourself apart from your culture, what you're doing is, to a certain extent, you're alienating yourself. So you may understand yourself better, you may understand your culture better, but in the process of that, you're going to make yourself strange. You're going to make your culture strange, you're going to make yourself strange. And to the extent that you've inculcated the values of your culture that you're about to interrogate from a very different standpoint, you are alienating yourself, from your learned patterns, from your expectations. And so this is not a optional element. It is a necessary element. It will have this, it's setting yourself aside impact if you do choose to pursue this, and the extent you choose to pursue it, this is part of the impact that will have. So it is a discovery, but it is one that does change the way your outlook, and will make your outlook very different from, considerably different from most of the people that you'll interact with most of the time. And again, this isn't a variable or a maybe. It is, to the extent that you're successful at this, it will absolutely be true. The flip side of that, as I said before, is the goal of and the core of a classical education is to understand yourself better, understand your world better, so that you can express your power and your potential. This is really, it's very simple. It's not a complex sort of equation that they drew up, but it's because if you were getting these types of education, you were already an important person, or someone who had a real chance of being an important person, because these educations were unbelievably expensive. Private tutors, lots of time. Generally you had to travel to do this, to get your Greek. So people would finish in Rome. You would send your promising young sons. Sorry, this is going to be sons, off to Athens to learn, get their Greek perfect. Because if you had really good Greek, that was, of course, now you were really someone important. And so the expense and time and hiring specialized slaves or freemen who could train you, it's unbelievably expensive. And so you were assumed that you were going to be someone quite important. And so when they were educating people, this was the idea. You're going to be powerful, or you already are. You're an important person. You're going to be more important. And so that's how you want to be educated. The education of someone who's powerful, who's going to need to understand themselves in the world so that they can express that and exert control over the environment in which they inhabit. So that goal led to the conquest of the Roman Empire, which may be not that great. But if we assume that we're not going to try and conquer the world, although it's up to you, it is this notion of trying to find what's innate in you and being able to express and make those concepts, ideas, understandings, having efficacy in the world in a particular kind of way that we'll talk about more. But that's the goal. This is what they were shooting for, and sometimes achieved. So, with that background in, let's ask where we are. Why do we feel alienated already, perhaps, or we feel dissatisfied with the education? Either we haven't had the opportunity to receive, or we received an education that we feel like whatever else it didn't help us with these core concepts. And one, it's easy, and I don't mean to criticize educational institutions. I've done that in the other series on education. You can check that out if you like. But they're just certain assumptions that you can say, okay, these are just assumptions. One, they're large systems. Anytime you have a large system, they are by nature not geared towards the individual. It's sort of a slider, right? You have to do, on average, as you have 20 students in a class, you have to set the class standard somewhere. You're either going to set it too high, and so you're going to lose some students on the bottom, or you're going to set it too low, and you're going to lose some students, right? All of these variables are complex, and so whatever your criticisms are, that is one problem. A bigger issue, I would say, besides that, is simply our current assumption that education is for jobs, that this is what you do. If you get an education it's so that you can get a job, then life is good and everything falls into place. Of course, we know this is, in practice, we know this is absolutely not true, but functionally we still believe it, and we act as if we believe it. And this has come about from a curious historical, this is one of your classic correlation does not equal causation moments in history. Because in ancient world, again, all the way up until very recently, if you had an education, you were by definition an unimportant person. You were either a scribe for the king, or a priest, or maybe a lawyer or a doctor, when lawyers and doctors were incredibly scarce. And so it set you apart. It made you into a sort of separate class. And so education correlated with power, authority, and importance very directly. But the link was not causal, it was just correlative. And what happened as economies grew, we moved in the industrial age, this truth was there. Like, oh, look, the economy is booming in the industrial age. We have more educated people. And there was this correlation of, higher education societies had more booming economies. And so this correlation got built into our minds that, oh, the more education you get and the more education your society is, the wealthier your society is. Therefore, universal education is good. And so let's get more education because that'll bring more economic growth, which will make your society better. And this flywheel got started. Now, there are a lot of other arguments for education, by the way. This is just one that has come to absolutely dominate today. Then this got reversed. So all these education people, pro-education people and pro-economic people has arguing, look, education produces a good economy. And so what slowly happened is they said, okay, if that's true, then let's see the payoff. You say it does, it correlates strongly, so where is the payoff? We want to see. So then what's the best amount of economic in return we can get for the least amount of investment? See, once you make the economic efficiency argument, well, now you're in this world of trade-offs and feedbacks. If you'll go to school for 4 years and get, this much benefit, maybe we can get almost that much benefit if you're only in school for 3 years or 2 years or 1 year, right? And so all this sort of efficiency and economic output and outcome has come to dominate the understanding of an education. And it's very strange because much of it makes no sense once you investigate this. So, for instance, if you have a bachelor's degree, and this is in the United States for the last 20 years, from like 1995, 94, 95 is when this starts, going up to last year, until we have recent statistics. If you have a college degree, your unemployment rate has averaged over the last 25 years, 30 years, about 3%, give or take. The highest ever recorded was 5%. So what this means is if you have any college degree, your unemployment rate is going to be pretty spectacularly low. I mean, capping out during the great financial crisis at 5%, that's amazing. And you can take unemployment statistics with a grain of salt, blah, blah, blah. And yet, however you judge this, that's pretty impressive. High school is roughly double that. If you have a high school education, your low is going to be average over those same times about 5.5%. High of unemployment is about 10%, again, during the financial crisis. So just about double that. If you have no high school education or you didn't graduate high school, it almost doubles again. So your running unemployment rate is going to be about 10% with a high of about 15% during the great financial crisis. This is, again, all higher. By the way, if you're a minority, of course, that will run those numbers up. So what this tells us is having any education is valuable from an employment standpoint. But what they keep trying to do is tell you that you have to have a certain education. So it is better if you want to be employed because any degree will give you this incredible boost in unemployment. Any college degree is going to dramatically improve your chance of employment. And in fact, even a high school diploma will dramatically improve your chances of employment. So what does this mean? And this is where I think we make this mistake, is then the question is, what kind of employment do I want, right? If any degree, as we've just seen, produces really, really strong employment rates, then the question is, what kind of employment do you want? What are you interested in? And then to answer that question, so if we're just talking about the most basic, stupid education equals jobs argument, this still doesn't help, because what you have to then ask yourself is, what kind of job would I like? And to answer that question, you need to know two things. Drum roll, please. Who you are. You need to understand yourself, and you need to understand a lot about the world. And so you end up even if you just make the dumb assumptions about education is for employment, you end up back where you needing the answers that you would only be provided if you had a sort of classical style education, because to understand the kind of job you would like, and you need to know who you are, and you need to understand the kinds of impacts and variability and environments that you're likely to work in the world. And so this seeming answer actually does nothing. It doesn't tell us anything. It says, oh, here's a bunch of jobs, pick one that looks likely for you, and then follow this course. And then at the end of it, you'll get that job, and then just shut up. And if you don't like that job, well, you made a mistake. The education system that didn't provide you with the background to understand yourself and the environment that you might be working in, you can't blame them. It's your fault, right? Like this is the way it's constructed. Another aspect, so again, even if you make the most base assumptions, you are right back to needing to have the sort of background and understanding that is core to a classical education. But even more serious, I think, or at least equally serious on this, is this increasing emphasis on specialization, and that they want people to have increasingly specialized skills. By the way, this is both for college, technical education, and trade education, right? Become an electrician, become a plumber, become an HVAC person, become a dentist, become a dental hygienist, become a nurse. These narrowing, like this, the more specialized you are, the better off you are. The more specialized your education, the better your outcome will be. Now, this is a trick, and it is absolutely counter. This would be like the fundamentally most opposite kind of education you could receive from a classical education. And there's a couple of tricks here that I want people to notice. One, and again, it's not that any of these specialties are bad. These are all great things to pursue if you want to. But here's the trick that happens quite often. And that is, if I can get you to get a specialized education, what this does is it transfers the risk and the cost of a set of skills from an employer to you. So if I want to hire somebody who can do HVAC, I can either hire somebody who seems like a pretty good person, hardworking, we can get along with them, she's going to do a great job, he knows what he's up to, and train them. Now, I've taken the risk and I've taken the cost on, and I'm training you if I'm the employer, right? Or I can get you to do it yourself. So I can say, you go get those skills, you pay for them, you put in the time, and then if I need you, I'll hire you. And as long as I need you, I'll hire you. And as soon as I don't need you, I'll just fire you. Or if the world changes and we don't need HVAC people anymore, now we need, something else, then you're out of luck, because now you have this very narrow, specialized sets of skills, which for whatever reason were in demand 10 years ago, aren't in demand today. This happens all the time. Certain specialties come in to vogue, they go out of vogue, they're easy to get, they're hard to get, right? This is all the swirling. And the trick for this kind of education, though, is you have a very narrow set of skills. And if you take the risk and invest the time, and then those need for those skills go away, you're screwed. Now, if the need for the skills go away after someone else invested the time, after someone else took the risk, that's different, right? You're like, okay, well, I got paid, I learned a set of skills. Okay, the world didn't work out, that's fine. But notice where the risk is who's taking on the risk. And that shifting is historically strange. Because it used to be if you wanted to learn something, you would be apprenticed. And the interesting thing is about apprenticeships where they were generally indentured. So you had to work for somebody for 5 years or 7 years. And that is because you are learning a trade, which is valuable, and you're doing work for them, which is valuable for the employer. But at the end of it, you can go on and set up shop for yourself. So the employers needed to make sure that they got their, years of service out of you, got your value. So you were paying for your education by working and all of this. I'm not suggesting we go back to that system, but it does let you realize, back in the day, the risk was taken by the employer, who was like, okay, I'm going to exploit this person and beat them and be horrible in all kinds of ways, but at least you're getting something for your labor. In education now, the risk is very much onto the student. Classical education is the other way around, not specialization, but generalization, so that no matter what happened in the world, no matter what happened in the environment, you have some means of responding and you have a broad set of skills that will allow you to adjust and adapt and continuously maintain your relevance. And because you understand the world and you understand yourself, you don't face this problem. So it strove to make classical in the Renaissance period, they actually called it universal man, right? A person of skills and outlooks and insight that were universally applicable. Of course, this is a very high bar. Would they meet it? Probably not. But this is the concept, is like, oh, even if some specialty goes away or some skill set is no longer valid, that's fine, because I have a deep base of learning and insight and skills developed that I can pivot into some other realm. And what they want to say, and they do say, by the way, in the modern world is like, oh, that was back then when the world was less complicated. Today, the world is very much more complicated. So we need these very refined, highly specialized people who don't have any other skills, who can only do one thing because that's very efficient. Efficient for whom? It's efficient if you're a large employer, because when you need a specialty, you can hire it. When you don't need it, you can fire it. And because the specialist is the one who's taken all the risk, you get all the benefit and none of the risk. That's genius. This is very efficient for employers. For people, this is incredibly inefficient and incredibly risky, as we keep discovering. There's a reason people change careers now like 3 or 4 times in an employed lifetime. It's because of the incredible transformative nature of the world in which we live. So again, not saying it's bad to have a specialized set of skills, probably very good and often very fulfilling, which we'll get to. But this is not the same as saying, oh, don't have the other. These are not mutually exclusive, and this is the problem. It's like, oh, let's get rid of all that waste of time that we're spending giving people sort of a more classically grounded sort of education, because what's really efficient and where the big return is in specialization. So those two notions of who's taking the risk, making yourself way too narrow, is one problem with the modern system. And 2 is the notion that even if you buy all their arguments, you still can't escape the need to understand yourself and understand the world if you're going to make any sort of meaningful choice about what sort of career or job or education that you want, right? It's sort of a necessary element, which we tend to ignore. And so what happens is you end up in a place where even though you might be educated, I talk to people about this all the time, they don't feel like they got the education that is serving them because, I went to a law degree, I went to school for a long time, I learned a lot, I read a lot, I studied a lot, and yet somehow I don't feel like I have a full active life of the mind. I don't feel like I'm integrated in an intellectual community. Those things seem to have escaped me. And this is why, because that's a different set of skills entirely. Another aspect of this, and the last aspect of this for the introduction, is the complete mistake that we've made, pretty systematically, I'd say, which is the ancient world was very interested in power. Oh my goodness, were they interested in power? And therefore, they were somewhat interested in money. What's happened in the modern world, and modern cultural conception of the world, is there's been this incredible mistake, which is to equate power and money, right? Like, if you have money, you have power. And this, of course, is an obvious, and one would even say trivial, sort of why even bring this up kind of mistake. However, it is 100% core to the nature of our understanding of the world, is that we think that, if you get more money, you have more power. And this is, of course, it's just not true. And so when you have an education system that says, hey, if you get a good job that makes good money, then you are in business because the money itself justifies everything else. See, this is another version of that mistake, because it's like, oh, what people want, I would say on average, is not so much money as the power that money will deliver. However, money is a power, and money is a type of power, absolutely, not arguing that in any way. However, it can only be seen as and be fulfilling when one understands power generally, what kind of power they want, how they're trying to act and behave in the world, what sort of impacts do they want. And the notion of just more money equals better, which is, of course, what we're told ad infinitum. Hence, by the way, that if you look at the different careers that schools tend to promote and talk about, they're consistently going, oh, well, this one makes more than that, and this is a higher paying career than that. Oh, and this one is better job opportunity, higher. So, like, therefore, better job equals higher paying job, as opposed to understanding how do you want to express your power? What is your power? How do you want to make this active in the world? So this concept of self-expression, of self-efficacy, by the way, power in this sense, I mean, is the power to express oneself and make one's sort of views and desires real, to make them manifest, to fulfill them. There's a great passage in Plato where Socrates is arguing with a guy, and Socrates just losing his mind. I mean, I can't remember the name of the guy. I should have just flew out of my mind because it's one of my favorite passages. And he says, Socrates says, well, what is the good? And the guy says, well, the good is obviously to be able to do what you want to provide for you and your friends, right? Like you, your friends, and your family, you take care of them, and then that's the good. And Socrates says, no, but what about wisdom? And the guy's like, I don't care about wisdom. It's good to have the power to be able to provide for your friends and your family and to be able to do what you want. Like, this is the good. And what philosophical history has done is, because we idolize Socrates so much, rightly so, and Plato, rightly so, but we forget that really, no, that's a very good argument, right? Like, this is actually the core. And Socrates agrees on this, oddly. Slight digression here, of course, on Plato and Socrates, because what Socrates ends up arguing is that, no, it's wisdom that allows you to express yourself and understand the world and therefore have the power you want. Wisdom is the path to power. And the other guy is saying, well, maybe, but there's all these other paths to power too. So they're arguing actually about the same thing, like, where does power come from? But so they were not confused about what they're trying to do. So if you want to be a musician, the ability to play the music you want to play, this is a type of power. And it's a very different type of power than someone who is, say, an architect who wants to be able to design and build things, right? That's a very different type of power that is going to be manifest differently in the world. It's going to be a different path. I mean, there's all these different elements in that. But for instance, it just popped in my mind, if I mention an architect, maybe a good example of this, maybe not, we'll find out, is, people go to architect school and they want to, I would say on average, they want to design and build things and see them in the world. A very laudable, very human, very, basic instinct. But if you end up at a firm that does big things and you're at a desk and you're scribbling all day, and you might be making good salary, you might be getting promoted, you might be doing all the right things, but you're starving because you're not expressing the fundamental power. The fundamental power, like, no, I actually want to see the things I designed built. See, that's different. You didn't probably go into architecture school, maybe you did, saying, I want to sit behind a computer all day doing drafts of some sort of structural integrity thing for some big company, and I will never ever see one of these things come to life, and I'll never be the person designing them. So it might be vastly more gratifying to go to architecture school and build crazy shit on the beach out of driftwood than it is to work in a big firm in a high-rise building with air conditioning behind a computer. Now that might be great too. You might love that, but right? So what the kind of power you're trying to express really matters, and understanding that really matters. And so what we've done is we've collapsed this in the modern education system and said, oh, if you have money, which equals have steady employment, equals then you will have the power that you want, and therefore you can do what you want. The problem is this assumes that everybody knows what they want, everybody knows that money delivers that, and if they get money, they know how to spend it so that they will be happy and their lives will be fulfilled, and their capacities will be expressed and recognized. Obviously, this is a non-starter, right? This is, again, an obvious falsehood that doesn't need a lot of reflection to help us recognize that, yeah, this does not work. In fact, my favorite current example of this is the degree to which we've inculcated these values, that just if you have the money, then everything will be fine, is the obsession. I mean, like the obsession, again, which I've mentioned before, in the art world with the price of art. If you see art ever reported on in the general press, it is almost all either got stolen, and then they'll say how much it was worth when it was stolen, or something goes to auction and they say, oh, this is going to get this much money. And so the whole metric of the world of art becomes equated with money, and then the power of art becomes equated with the power of art to make money, which again is just this like bizarre never land of a misunderstanding of the nature and history and development of art and how it influences our lives and just every other aspect of that's possible. But what happens then with art education is that it becomes sort of art employment education, which is probably just simply not art education at all in a lot of ways. And so when you think about like where we are, I think it's important to note that the entire structure and nature of our education system is to prepare people for employment, because we've made these mistakes about what gives us power, where it comes from, how we might experience it. And the entire impetus, therefore, is the opposite of what a classical education is. So we'll return to that. Now, in the liberal, the original meaning of a liberal education was an education for a free person. And what they meant by a free person is A, not a slave, but also someone who is free to choose whatever they wanted to do, or at least free-ish. And if you think about it in those terms, like any sense of studying for a particular outcome other than your own pleasure, your own interests, your own pursuit of what you think is important, is a betrayal of a liberal education. And so again, it's hard to articulate how unbelievably different the approach was in its core assumptions and its core motivations. And so when I say this is going to be an alienating process, that's what I mean. You're having to unlearn the sort of complete outlook that says that these things are functional for other than your own personal use. These things, that the pursuit of education is to get money, more money more efficiently equals more better, right? Those sorts of assumptions simply, they have to go away. And it's easy to articulate them this way, and you go, of course, that's silly, and we know this isn't true, but boy, are they inside. And you'll run into them consistently. And finally, this is in no way to say that there's, again, anything wrong with the specialization of, we do need jobs. We do live in a world where, making a living is a thing, and we should not be alienated from that process. And that's what I think the most bizarre outcome of our current system is that it makes something that could be great alienating, right? Because we misunderstand what we're doing. Often people feel suckered into it. They feel like they don't have many options. This is, by the way, it's one thing not feel like you have many options if you don't have much education, because maybe you don't, maybe they are limited. But the more you understand the world, the more background tends, the broader those opportunities tend to be. But the narrowing of specialization creates this kind of crazy world where highly educated people feel very trapped, which is the opposite of a liberal education, which is by definition supposed to free you, right? The degree to which you feel trapped is the degree to which you have not gotten basically a good education, because a good education is designed to make you feel free, make you feel powerful, make you feel efficacious at all times, right? This sort of one way to read that if you understand yourself in the world. And so it's the example of we live in a world where we have people who are obese and malnourished, which is an impressive achievement, right? Starving and malnourished, no problem. Obese and not malnourished, that's easy too. But to be obese and malnourished, I mean, that takes some real amazing cultural wrongness to achieve that. However, think about this in terms of education, that we have a lot of educated people who feel really trapped, who feel very much enslaved to a system, which is to say that what they think of as education and how they've been educated is really the polar opposite of what the ideal of education in the classical world, which was nothing if not a desire to not be a slave. How do I free myself? How do I free my mind so I can understand the world and myself so that I can express myself and my capacities to the fullest extent possible? That was the concept. This was the idea. And so when we find ourselves in a world, I was just reading articles in preparation of this for the people who, like Google's going through a rough patch apparently, making all the money in the world, but the people who are working there, they're unhappy, they don't feel compensated, they feel nervous about their jobs, they feel miserable, they feel overworked. This is sort of going downhillish. One, first world problems, like, hey, you're working at Google, you're making plenty of money, maybe shut up. But think about what this means too. These are highly educated, highly motivated by all standards of our culture, highly successful people who feel miserable, unhappy, trapped, and don't like their jobs. Which is to say, they don't understand what education is for. Because if you feel miserable, unhappy, and trapped, the ancient world would say, well, you got a bad education, because that is the definition of a bad education. So this is a process of how to begin to redress this. How do we begin to re-educate our minds to do this ourselves so that we can increasingly and more fully express ourselves? And again, this is not a purity process, right? Like, we're not magically going to transform everything. We're never going to have to do anything we don't want, right? It's all that nonsense. No, this is just a process of how we go about and why we go about learning or relearning or unlearning all the steps. By the way, unlearning, the hardest of the steps. To unlearn something is just brutally difficult. So that we have new thought patterns and new outlooks that allow us, again, to understand our world and ourselves better, because that is the real goal. So, conclusion to introduction. Part 1 will come very soon, which will be an introduction to the Trivium. Step 1, literacy. Thank you very much.